My son's toys and board games have pretty much taken over our downstairs closet. So today I'm going to build a massive sideboard that hopefully has what it takes to keep the dice rolling and add some premium storage space at the same time, on Timber Biscuit. Alright, so as I mentioned, today we're going to be building a really large sideboard. And since it's going to be a really large sideboard, I'm going to use plywood for the outside carcass of the piece. And that's because using plywood will save me a ton of time with making panels, and it'll ensure that the piece stays flat and square throughout its lifetime. Now, in past projects, you guys have seen me use Baltic birch plywood for cabinets, but on this one, I'm going to be using maple veneer plywood. I've used maple veneer plywood on a few other projects, but I gotta say that there's some things that happened with this project and this plywood that I wasn't super happy about, but we'll dive more into that when we get there. So for now, what you see me doing is just breaking down all of my sheet goods into more manageable sizes. Now, one other thing that I decided to do with this project is use some pre-finished plywood, and that's going to be for my inside of my drawers as well as my back panel. The stuff that you'll see on the outside of the case is left unfinished because I'm going to finish that to match all of my hardwood pieces throughout the project. And this pre-finished stuff is about as helpful as a lemon. So for now, we'll call it my lemonade. And sorry, bad puns are just how I roll. So now that we've broken the seal, let's keep things rolling by diving into the design. With this piece, as always, I'm going to keep things modern. But with this one, again, I'm trying to maximize my storage space. So I'm going to have 2 large cabinets on either end and a row of 3 drawers in the center. Now, the 3 drawers can hold knickknacks and that type of thing, but I really made sure to make those cabinets on the end large enough to store those board games. And for you longtime viewers, yes, on this one, we're going with fixed shelves. And there's a reason for it that I'll cover when we get there. So now that we're all on the same page, let's get to building that carcass. So the first thing I do with any plywood project is just choose my outside face. Now, there's always a better side to any sheet of plywood, but sometimes that C side looks better than the B and vice versa. So really just choose what you think looks best. And once I've got that all figured out, I can go ahead and cut my miters. So what I'm going to do here is just cut my initial miter over at the table saw. And this will set up my measurements for my wraparound grain pattern that I'll do with 2 of the panels. Now, because this is plywood, I obviously can't cut all of my panels out in one straight shot, so I'm going to cut them in the center and we'll match up that grain pattern on the ends. So once I have that initial miter cut, I'll bring the pieces back over to my bench and lay those out. Again, what we're going for here is our final length. And the final length for this piece is going to be 66 inches. Once I've established that miter on that 66-inch line, I can go ahead and rotate my offcut and then place my next miter as close as I can to my previous cut. This will ensure that my grain pattern wraps around nicely on 2 of my edges. So the one thing to keep in mind is what angle you're going to approach the piece at in its natural setting. So if you want to put this in a corner, for instance, you want to put that outside facing corner with the wraparound edge facing out. And that's just something to think about whenever you're building a piece. And if you're building it for a client, you can ask them where it's going to go so you can build it in the correct orientation. And while we're talking about where this piece is going to go, if you guys want to build one that can go in your house and you want plans for this project, just let me know down in the comments, and if there's enough interest, I'll put the plans together. And as a side note, all my plans include the PDF, the SketchUp file, DWF files, and SVG files for those with CNCs, as well as full-scale printable templates for those of you who just want to print them out. So yeah, just let me know. Alright, so what I'm doing here is cutting out my vertical partitions as well as my shelves. Now, I'm going to keep these oversized for now, so when I put the carcass together in a little bit, I can gather my final measurements and then trim these down to their final length. And I've covered this in the past, but the reason I do this is because plywood's not actually 3/4 of an inch. It's really 23/32 of an inch, and that gets a little confusing. The other way you could say that is 18 millimeters for my international viewers, but hey, I'm decilingual, so I go back and forth. So the next step in the process was to cut the dados for the vertical partitions. And to do that, I'm just going to use my crosscut sled and a dado stack. Again, for you international folks who don't have discs of death, you're going to have to use a router. So all I'm doing here is just using my sled with a 1/2-inch groove cut into it, and I'm going to use my fence as a stop to make sure that I have the dados aligned on both sides in the center. Doing this just takes any guesswork out of where these dados should live and ensures that they're aligned. Once I had my dados cut, I could go ahead and lay out the joinery for my miters. Now, this isn't a required step for this project by any means, but I always find it a lot easier to plow some dominoes into the top end of miters. This helps a lot when it comes time to assemble everything and make sure that those miters stay nice and aligned. Now, I know that everyone has access to a domino, so this isn't a must for this part of the project, but again, it's one of those things that helps out a lot. It's just like when I had that appointment with a psychic, but she called me and said I couldn't make it. I'd thank her, but she already knows. Alright, so my next step was to tap in all my dominoes and assemble my carcass. And there's a couple reasons for assembling the carcass at this point. A, we get to check to make sure that everything's aligned perfectly and that we don't need to make any adjustments. And B, we get to take the final measurement for the length in our partitions. And I guess C, this also helps me illustrate why those dominoes are so helpful. No clamps. Alright, so with my final measurement taken, I could head back over to the table saw and trim down those vertical partitions. Now here I'm using my dado stack to cut these down. I know that's not like the ideal situation, but I didn't feel like resetting everything for a crosscut blade to do so. And that's because I'm going to need this dado stack to cut the ends on my tenons. So what I'm going to do first is just set up a sacrificial fence and then set the depth and height for my blade. The sacrificial fence allows me to bury the blade into the fence and allows me to really dial in that fit. Now what we're going for is a snug fit, but we do want to make sure there's a little wiggle room in there, and that's because plywood isn't perfectly flat. It's relatively flat, but not perfect. So that little bit of space allows for things to align and gives a little room for that glue. Yeah, that'll do. Next, it was time to lay out the shelves. And for the shelves here, I'm going to go with stopped dados. And that's because the doors on the cabinets are going to be inset. Plus, I'm going to be adding an opening mechanism to the cabinet doors so that I don't have to use pulls, but more on that when we get there. So I'll cut these stop dados over at my table saw. And to do that again, I'm going to use my 1/2-inch sled. Now setting up stop dados can be a little bit tricky when you're using a sled, but once you have everything dialed in, they're super easy to repeat. So obviously the first step is to make sure that you clearly mark out your dados so you know where to stop and which side to cut the dados. And then from there, what I do is just mark out on my sled where the stop needs to happen. This way I can push the sled forward to that mark and then just clamp an offcut to my outfeed table to create a stop. Just make sure to obviously test this before you go to your actual workpiece, and also leave about an 1/8-inch gap between where you want that stop line to actually occur so you can carve that area out and flush everything up. Just don't do like I did here and get stuck in your own head about what to do next. You gotta pick it up, go over to the bench, and use your chisels to flush that up. So while I set that up over at the bench, let me take a quick second to say that if you're enjoying this video, give it a like. I really appreciate the support and it helps the video spread to more people. Thanks. So once I've used a marking knife to lay out my cut lines, I just grab a chisel and a mallet and tap away. Here we don't really care what the bottom of the dado looks like, we just want to make sure that there's plenty of room for our tenon. And the reason I point out to not worry about the bottom is because plywood is kind of tricky when it comes to chisels. I do go back and use a router plane to make sure we've got an even flat surface across the bottom of our dado, but beyond that, I don't really care what the bottom of this dado looks like. Next it was time to cut the rabbet around the back edge of our carcass. Now this is just a 1/4-inch deep rabbet, so I'll set the cut up again using a sacrificial fence. What this is going to do is allow for my rear panel to inset into the back of the carcass, and in doing so, it'll assist with preventing some racking. Now since my top and bottom pieces are so long, I just use a roller stand to help give me a little support off the back edge of the saw. Then from there, I could go ahead and do the same thing to my 2 side panels. Now early on, I talked a little bit about using fixed shelves. And in previous videos, we've talked about why I use shelf pins versus fixed shelves for certain types of furniture. And with this piece, the design really dictates the need for fixed shelves. Because the sideboard is so long and wide, it really needs the fixed shelves to help with the support. The carcass might be okay with just the vertical partitions, but I feel like the fixed shelving is doing a lot for the structure as a whole. So while on some pieces I do love using shelf pins, I think in this instance, fixed shelves just made sense. So what I did here was follow the same steps I did for the vertical partitions, where I assembled everything in the carcass, and then took my measurements before cutting everything down and cutting the tenons on the shelves. And with a little patience and good luck, the shelves fit perfectly the first time. Then I could say something like, I think that looks alright. So from there I could take the shelves over to my bandsaw and notch off a 1/4 inch off the end of my tenons. What this is going to do is allow for a nice seamless fit on the edge of my shelves. It's important to keep this step in mind whenever you're doing stop dados so you don't see the gap from where the dado stops in your joinery. Now I'm not going to be able to perfectly flush this up over at the bandsaw, so instead what I'm going to do is cut as close as I can and then take the boards over to my bench and then use my chisels to clean everything up. Now again, chiseling plywood is not the easiest thing in the world, so whenever you're using chisels on plywood, just take your time and mind your digits. You know, you're kind of attached to them. And then from there, I could slide in the shelves and check the fit. Here I can make any adjustments if needed, but I think these are good. I mean, look at that. Like a glove. And if you're enjoying this content and you think it's a good fit for you, make sure you subscribe. I put out new videos about woodworking tips, tricks, and projects all the time, so subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Alright, so here what I'm doing is just trimming my shelves down to their final depth. Now in the design, I kept in mind the fact that this was going to be plywood and it was going to need some edge banding. So again, I notched my tenon at a 1/4 inch. This way I could put a 1/4 inch of edge banding on the front and it'll give me a 1/2 inch gap from my dado to the front of my shelf. So the next step in the process was to trim out some of that edge banding. And here I'm going to use some hard maple that I've planed down to 3/4 of an inch. From there, I trimmed down 2 3/8 inch strips and then planed those down to a 1/4 inch. Next, I'll just use some glue and some painter's tape to attach the edge banding. Now, because I planed the edge banding down to 3/4 of an inch, I have a slight overhang on both sides to the shelf, which is great because it gives me plenty of room to flush this up here in a second. And check it out. You know what's blue and smells like red tape? Blue tape. All jokes aside, this is a simple and easy way to attach your edge banding, and it looks great. The final step before we get to assembling this carcass is to go ahead and flush up that edge banding. And to do that, I'm just going to use a pole saw and some chisels. Now, you could do this all at one time when you cut the tenons. The only reason I don't is because I think it's a little bit more difficult to keep things square when you're going through a 1/2 inch. But if you're comfortable doing so, you can attach your edge banding and then cut the notches. Either way, tomato, tomato. Or tomato, tomato. Something like that. Alright, so as promised, next it was time for assembly. And we'll go ahead and speed things along here, but for this assembly, I used Titebond 2 Extend to make sure I had plenty of working time since there was a lot of pieces that needed to go on for this assembly. My wife was also kind enough to join me in the shop for this portion and hand me clamps as well as be there for moral support. Because as we all know, the most stressful part of being a woodworker is the glue up. And that'll do. Alright, so next it was time to get started on my panels for my drawer fronts as well as my cabinet doors. Now for this portion, I'm going to be using 4/4 hard maple. And what I'm doing here is just breaking my maple down into more manageable sizes. Right now, these are about 2 inches longer than they actually need to be, but that should give me plenty of space when laying out my panels. So these boards are S2S and they're already relatively flat, so here I'm just going to skip planing them down to 3/4 of an inch, then I'll bring them over to my assembly table to lay out the grain pattern. Now I have a general idea of what I want to do with the grain pattern on most of my pieces, but here what I'm doing is just refining what that look is going to be. When I'm laying out panels, I don't look to alternate the growth circles like I've seen some other people do. Instead, I just look for the best grain pattern that I can possibly find. And once I found something that I'm happy with, I go ahead and mark I's and O's for in and out on the bottom portion of the edges of the boards. From there, I can take the boards over to my joiner and use those I's and O's as references for which way the boards should face. If it's an O, I'll face it out when I'm going across the joiner blade, and if it's an I, I'll face it in towards the fence. I talked about this before, but it just gives me complementary angles in case the joiner is off at all. Now, I follow this process for one edge of all of my boards. And then from there, I take the boards over to my table saw to clean up the other edge. And this will give me a nice square area for gluing these panels up. Even though all my edges aren't going to necessarily meet in the center and don't need to be perfectly square, when clamping up the panels, this creates nice even pressure. From there, I can go ahead and go back over to the joiner and clean up any of the edges that I just cut that end up in the center of the board. Again, following my previously marked I's and O's. This will wrap up that whole process and give us a really nice tight joint and a seamless glue line. So when gluing up panels, I only apply glue to one edge. This way I don't have a ton of squeeze out to clean up, and honestly, it gives me a better result for the panel at the end of the day anyway. So once I apply a nice thin layer of glue, I go ahead and just clamp everything together. Here I'm trying to leave about 12 inches between each clamp so that I can evenly distribute that clamping pressure across the entire panel. I also like to throw in a top clamp to help offset some of the bowing that will occur from the clamping pressure down below. And since I'm not using dominoes, a couple of F-style clamps at the joint seams will hold everything nice and flat. Kind of like Kyrie Irving likes his earth. So once the panels have dried, I can use what's possibly the most annoying tool in the shop, at least sound-wise, and that's a glue scraper. I use this to just remove some of that top layer of glue, but I don't press hard enough to take a chunk out of the maple. And you're welcome for saving all of your ears from bleeding by lowering the volume on that clip. From there, I give everything a quick sanding, and then I bring the boards over to my table saw and cut the panels down to their final width. And I'll say final width loosely, because at this point these panels will be the exact width that they need to be, meaning they're actually a bit oversized. And I think that's the best way to approach panels like this that are going to be inset, is to cut things to the exact width. From there, you can go back and finesse those edges, which I will in a little bit, to make sure that you have a nice snug fit and an even reveal all the way around your drawers as well as your cabinet doors. If you shoot for perfection right off the saw, odds are that when you sand or hand plane back your saw marks, you're going to overshoot your size. So go big and work your way smaller. Kind of like us short people. You got to hand it to us, because we can't reach it on our own. Alright, so with the panels cut to their oversized final width, I could trim them down to their final height. Again, here we're going to be oversized. We do want to avoid cutting our drawer panel down to its final height, and that's because we're going to use that continuous grain pattern across the front of all three of our drawers. So if we cut them to the final height now, that panel is going to be too small when we go to cut out our drawers, which is going to make us want to break stuff like this. And so instead, what I do with this is a little bit of math to find out exactly how large each of those three panels should be, and I cut the panels to that exact size. Again, we'll finesse that fit later on, so we want to be a little oversized. Just remember, It's easy to take things away in woodworking, but it's much more difficult to put things back. From there, I can go ahead and install my dado stack and a new zero clearance insert. And I'm going to use this setup to give my doors a little bit of texture. Now, I've done this technique a few times on the channel, and I really love the effect that this gives. Here, I'm only going with an 1/8 inch deep groove, so it'll just add a little depth. And again here, this is why I avoided using any domino joinery in the panels, because I feel like it's a little risky to have a domino in there. Even though I know I'm well below the depth needed to cut into the dominoes, I just didn't want to risk it. So since my dado stack is 3/4 of an inch, I just set up a stop on the end of my fence and use that to nudge my fence over 3/4 of an inch at a time. And when I'm cutting these grooves, I cut one, then rotate the board and cut the other. Now the only tricky part here is to make sure that all of your moves are exactly the same. If not, you'll end up with one really large or really thin strip in the center. So I highly recommend using a test piece. But honestly, any way you do it, it's a lot of cuts. Unfortunately, no matter what you do, whenever you cut grooves like this, they're going to require a bit of cleanup. So to do that, I'm going to use a combination of planes and sanding blocks. Now I don't really need for the depth of all of these to be exactly the same. If they're off by a 64th of an inch, you're never going to really be able to tell. So I prefer to use my shoulder plane to clean up the saw marks rather than a router plane. The router plane works well, but it does tend to tear out a lot more than the shoulder plane does, so that's why I go with the shoulder plane. And then from there, I can bring the doors over to my bench to finesse their fit. And here I'll just use a number 4 smoother and a small block plane to get everything nice and tight. Doing this removes all of those saw marks and really snugs up the doors so that I have a lot of control over that final fit and finish, which I love. And speaking of love, don't ever fall for a tennis player. Love means nothing to them. And hey, if you love these videos, you're going to love my Instagram too. So make sure you check that out so that you can stay up to date with what's going on in the shop. Next, it was time to get these doors hung. So to do that, I'll just use a couple of jigs to attach my Blum soft close hinges. Now, if you guys are curious about the jigs that I'm using here, I'll leave links to them down in the description so you can check them out. So with the mount attached to the cabinet, I could go ahead and drill my cups. And to do that, I'm just going to use another jig. I really like this one because it takes all the guesswork out of how deep and how much of a reveal you should leave. You just follow the instructions and make the adjustment on the jig itself. Once you do that, as long as your hinge placement is correct, all you have to do is plow on your holes and attach your hinges. And to do that, I'll just use a square and a self-centering drill bit. From there, I can drive on my screws and the hinges are attached. Just keep in mind that these hinges are pretty flexible. So if they don't fit perfectly the first time, just make a couple adjustments and test it again. And take a look at that. I'd say that's pretty tight. Next, I could install the soft close drawer slides. And again here, I'm going with Blum. Now, these are undermount drawer slides, so spacing them out is slightly different than your traditional drawer slide. So just keep in mind that your drawer boxes are going to sit about a 1/2 inch higher than they would if they were traditional drawer slides and you were mounting them to the bottom. Now, unlike the cabinet door hardware, I don't like to use any jigs for this. Instead, I just use an offcut that's set to the height that I want to mount the drawer slide, and I attach them. From there, I could get on to crafting the drawer boxes. Now, I'd already cut these strips out earlier in the video when I was cutting out all of my sheet goods. So from here, all I gotta do is cut in a 1/4 inch groove for the drawer box bottom. And for those who don't know, the difference between a groove and a dado is that a dado runs cross grain on a piece, while a groove runs with the grain. I feel like I see those intertwined, and there's actually a difference between the two, so I figured I'd point it out. Once I have all my grooves cut in, I could go ahead and cross cut my pieces down for the different lengths on my drawer parts. Now, when it comes to undermount slides, it's really important that you try to nail your drawer box sizes. And that's because there's not a ton of wiggle room for them to work properly. But in any case, the easiest way that I found to do this is to cut my grooves first, and then cut all my pieces to length over the crosscut sled. This way I don't have to run 12 individual pieces over my table saw blade. For the 6 drawer parts that I can, I'll use a stop block, and for the 6 that I can't, I'll just mark a line on my sled and make sure that I get as close as I can to lining them all up. Again, with drawer boxes, we want them to be as consistent as possible. Once I have all my sides, fronts, and backs cut out, I can go ahead and cut out the drawer bottoms. And for that, I'll use some pre-finished 1/4 inch ply. Now, I cut this out oversized earlier, and the reason I didn't cut it to its final width was because I didn't know what the final dimension of the drawers were going to be. So always try to take those final measurements off your actual workpiece. So the next step was to cut a rabbet onto the ends of my side panels. I don't always make drawer boxes this way, but since this is pre-finished plywood, I don't want to use any pins or nails that I would have to fill in later on. Next, I could take the back panels over to my bandsaw and cut in the notch for the drawer runner. Now, this is an added step that's only for those people that are ever going to use Blum drawer slides. If you're not going to use Blum drawer slides on any of your pieces, don't worry about this. But if you are using Blum drawer slides, you need to cut a notch on the rear panel so that the runner can wrap around the back of the drawer box. So I just use a strip of blue tape to indicate the stop point and make that cut. Then from there, it was time to glue and assemble these boxes. Now again, I've gone over this in tons of videos, but I'm going to recap it again here because these are slightly different. And this assembly shows why that rabbet is so important. Since we're not using any pins to hold our pieces in place, the rabbet gives us a nice square edge for our drawer fronts and backs to nestle in. So I only apply glue to those rabbets, and then I assemble the front and back of the drawers. From there I can slide on those two side panels and clamp everything together. Now what I'm doing here is just putting together the drawer box. From there I'll just add a little clamping pressure to all four sides, and I'm done. Nothing complicated, nothing crazy, and no wild jigs. Just glue and clamps. And after I repeat that 3 times, there we go. It's super simple, but I guess that's why lawyers don't have underwear drawers. They have briefcases. From there I could grab one more jig to drill in the holes to mount these to the slides. And this is another good one because if you turn it sideways, it gives you the mounting position for the clips. So once I have those holes pre-drilled, I could screw in the screws and attach the undermount clips. And there you go. I think we're good. The one thing I'll say about these is, like the hinges, they have a lot of adjustments. So make sure you center those adjustments before you mount on your drawer faces. Because if you don't, then you'll only be able to adjust your drawer faces up or only down. So make sure you center that piece before you mount the drawer faces so that you have the full range of motion. And speaking of the drawer faces, let's get to work on those. So here what I'm doing is just planing down the sides of my drawer face. Once I added my 1/16 of an inch shims between my drawer faces, the sides were a little bit tight. So I just use a block plane to dial in that fit. And if you're ever working with hard maple, I do recommend using a low angle plane because hard maple really likes to tear out. With all the drawer panels planed down, we could then again check the fit. Nice. Next, it was time to address the drawer pulls. And for the drawer pulls on this piece, I want to give a real subtle, elegant slit. So I cut out a template and then transferred those marks onto my workpieces. From there, I could take the drawer faces over to my bandsaw and rough cut them out. Now, as always with this process, we want to stay as close as we can to the line, but we don't want to cut into our workpiece. So here, I just take my time. I think another good motivator to take your time during this type of process is that you don't want to have to remake these panels or ruin that grain pattern. But I guess that's why people also buy pulls. And that got me thinking, do you prefer to integrate your pulls into your project, or do you like the process of picking out and choosing your pull hardware? For me, the project does dictate it sometimes, but when I can, I prefer to integrate my pulls. But let me know what you guys think down in the comments. Are you someone who likes to integrate your pulls into the design, or do you prefer to buy them? If you like to combine your pulls into the design, comment combine. And if you like to buy your pulls, comment buy them. I'm really curious to know what you guys think. And for anybody who starts out their comments with buy them or combine, I'll reply to you guys first, because as always, I know you're paying attention. So at this point, my drawer fronts are all flush trimmed to my template, and we can go ahead and get started on the back edge of the pull. And for that, what I'm going to do is just add a 45-degree chamfer so that the pulls are a little bit nicer to the touch. I think one thing that's often overlooked is how much we use our senses when we interact with a piece. And touch for a piece of furniture is pretty high on the list. Things not only need to look good visually, but they need to feel nice when people interact with them. To me, that's what really elevates a piece of furniture. So with our rear chamfers carved in, I could bring the pieces back over to the bench to finesse those edges. Now here, there's a little bit of burning on the start and end points for each of the chamfers, so I'm just going to use a rasp as well as a sanding block to remove those burn marks. This also is a good opportunity to fine-tune that transition and give us a nice wispy look. Most people will never even see this, but at least you will. Just like my friend who quit his job to be a mime. I haven't heard from him since. So the next step was to go ahead and attach our drawer fronts. And again, I try to do this in the simplest way possible. First, what I do is use a couple shims to help lift the drawer front off the bottom of the carcass. Then from there, I just use a couple clamps to hold the drawer front in place while I drill in a pilot hole, then drive in 2 screws. Next, I can remove the clamps and check the fit. Now again, earlier I mentioned that there were some adjustments on these drawer slides, so if they don't fit perfectly, I can always fine tune them using those. The rest of the process goes exactly the same way, where I use shims to space out my drawer fronts and clamps and screws to secure them in place. And when you're done with those simple steps, you'll have a beehive with no exit. You know, it'll be unbelievable. Or at the very least, cool. So next it was time to get started on the base. And to do that, I first need to rip down all of my lumber. So back over at the table saw, I just used a couple feather boards to keep everything aligned to the fence and rip down my boards. Here I'm going to cut these about 1/8 of an inch oversized so that I can plane them down to their final dimension over at the planer. And that'll save me a lot of time cleaning up saw marks later on. As you guys probably saw in the Rubo build, anytime that I can use my planer to finalize my dimension, I will, because it gives me a really nice clean finish. Another option would be to finish them off with a hand plane, but I'd much rather have the machines do the heavy lifting. Just don't tell them that. Then from there, I can rip down my 8/4 stock that'll make up my feet. Now I've already milled this down so that everything is nice and square, but at this point, they're still a little oversized. So I'll thickness them down just like I do the rails, and that'll give me an even thickness on all 4 sides. Which is great because you really shouldn't trust trees. They can be kind of shady. Alright, so the next step was to bring everything over to the planer and thickness those pieces down to their final thickness. Now again here, we're not taking a ton off, just enough to remove those saw marks. Alright, so with the base pieces all roughed out, I could take some of those offcuts and rip down some edge banding. Now my goal for the edge banding was to give a nice inside bevel around the entire carcass. This way it'll break up those hard edges as well as conceal our plywood. So with my table saw blade set to 45 degrees, I went ahead and ripped a bevel onto my 3/4 inch pieces. Again, these will be the same 3/4 inch thickness that we did for the shelves. My only note would be to make sure that you mark the back so that you know what side is up or down, because even though I'm aiming to make this bevel centered, it's probably not perfect. Just like my swordsmanship. It's a work in progress. Alright, so the first thing I do when making frames is initially cut one miter onto my workpiece. This way I can line that up with the edge of my carcass and get the correct length for the edge banding. I also really like doing it this way because there's no measurements involved. All my markings come directly from the carcass. I just mark off the edge, then bring it over to the table saw and trim it down. Now again here, it's best to keep your pieces long and then work your way backwards, fine-tuning that fit until you get everything nice and tight. From there, with a piece this long, I go ahead and glue on that top edge banding. This way I can reference off that for the rest of the cuts. And then from there, I just follow that same process and frame everything out one piece at a time. Again, this is why it was important to mark the outside of the edge banding, because we want that beveled edge to match up all the way around the interior. If for whatever reason it was off slightly on the inside or outside of the bevel, it would probably be noticeable. The human eye is really good at picking up imperfections when there's a lot of repetition like there is for the doors. So any small mistakes here might be glaring. And as I've shared before, if you guys don't have these edge banding clamps, don't worry about it, just use blue tape. It works perfect for this application. If you do want some, however, I'll leave a link down in the description. Alright, so with the glue drying on my edge banding, I could get to work on the feet. So the first thing I need to do is trim them down to their final length. And to do that, I'm just going to use my crosscut sled. Now, whenever you're building feet or legs, you want to start with a nice square edge, and then from there, you can trim them down to their final size. Another option here would be to use a stop block, and that's not a bad idea, but I didn't in this situation, and that's because I needed to avoid some of the darker colored spots that were inside the lumber. Another good idea is to cut 5 feet instead of 4, this way you have one that you can test with. And even if you don't test with it, if you do make a mistake, then you have one already cut and ready to go. It's much better than being like a bird learning to fly, where you're just going to wing it. So from there I could trim down the rails to their final length. And to do that, I'll just measure them both together so that I make sure I'm striking an even line across both my pieces at the same time. Now, because the length of this base is so long, I'm going to cut a center support as well. But at this point, I'm going to leave that center support long, because I actually don't know what the final size of that center support is going to be. And we'll talk about that a little more when we get there. From now, let's go ahead and trace out the template that I made based off the drawer fronts to the feet. In the sketch at the start of the video, I had a different base in mind. But while I was working in the shop, I thought it would be really fun to mimic the design on the drawer fronts into the feet. So that's where this shape came from. So for these feet, I'm just going to freehand them. So once I had my template marked out, I just took the feet over to the bandsaw and trimmed them out. Here I'm trying to get as close to that line as I possibly can. Once I have that first cut made, I just use some blue tape to tape my piece back on, rotate the foot, and make the second cut. This will give me a rough outline that I can finesse using my sander. The main thing to watch out for here is that you mark out your feet correctly. You don't want to go back to assembly and then realize you have 2 front left feet. It happens to the best of us. So as I mentioned, I'm just going to use my oscillating spindle sander to smooth out these curves. Now obviously in an ideal world, these feet would be perfect and all of them would be exactly the same, but that's not reality. So what I'm going for here instead is a nice smooth transition on all of my feet, which if I follow my pencil line, will get me about 98% there. Alright, so the next step was to mark out and cut my domino joinery for my base. So while I wrap that up, let me just take a moment to say that if you guys are enjoying these videos and you want to support the channel, I'd like to invite you to join my Patreon. There you'll get discount codes on merch, plans, an invite to the Discord server, and access to monthly live chats. Plus, you'll also get some free welcome gifts. The community continues to grow, so if that sounds like something you're interested in, check out the link in the description. And as always, to you guys who've already joined, thank you so much for your continued support. Your contributions go directly towards making these videos. So thank you guys, I'm super grateful. Alright, so with the exterior of the base assembled, I could go ahead and take my measurement and then trim down that center support, while trying to avoid yelling Jenga. From there, just plunge a couple mortises and pop it in place. Once I have the base assembled, I can go to maybe my most preachy part of any video and treat the feet. Now again, we've gone over this countless times, but it's so important to chamfer the bottom of your feet. It'd be a really sad day if one of these feet hung up on a carpet and ripped off the piece. So taking a few minutes to give them a proper chamfer can prevent future heartbreak. So with the feet all manicured, I could bring everything back over to the assembly table and glue up the base. Now this process is pretty straightforward. I just pop in the dominoes and squeeze everything together. And luckily that center support worked out perfectly to give my clamps something to squeeze onto. And I'm glad this came together quickly because it gave me plenty of time to read a whole book about glue. I couldn't put it down. We're okay now. Alright, so the last step before finish was to sand all my edge banding flush. Now at the start of the video I mentioned that I had an issue with this plywood, and that really reared its face during the sanding process. The veneer on this plywood is ridiculously thin, which is something I'm hearing a lot of others say as well. So just be mindful of that if you're working with any sheet goods in the near future. When it comes to mitered edges on plywood, I just like to use a screwdriver to gently roll those fibers over. From there I can lightly sand and it'll give me a nice crisp edge. With that I could place my brand and then get to the finish. And for the finish on this piece, I'll be using a hard wax oil. Now this is the same finish I've used on the last 3 pieces of furniture, and that's because I'm really loving this finish. I had gone about a year and a half without using Rubio Monocoat and then recently came back to it again, and it was like a whole new love affair. So you'll have to forgive me, but I feel like Rubio Monocoat might be one you see pretty often on the channel, at least for the foreseeable future. The only downside that I've found is that I never have enough of the hardener. So for whatever reason, I consistently have more of part A than I do part B, but maybe that's just something I'm missing. In any case, this is a great finish for a piece like this, where my son will undoubtedly have crayons, markers, and all sorts of crazy stuff going on top. Once the finish was dry, I went ahead and attached some figure 8 fasteners to the base. All I do is use a Forstner bit to bore out a small notch, then clip off the ends with a chisel, and use a self-centering bit to pre-drill the holes. From there, you just drive in a couple screws, flip the base onto the bottom, center it, and attach everything. Now you probably noticed by now that I don't have any pulls on my doors, and that's because I'm going to use these pushing magnetic catches as the opening mechanism. So this removes the need for pulls and gives me a much cleaner look. I just installed one to the underside of each side of the cabinet. And again, if you guys want to check these out, I'll leave a link in the description. From there, the last thing to do was trim down my back panel. And since again, it's pre-finished, I put that pre-finished face forward and then just use some 23 gauge pens to tack it in place. From there, we can cue the music and the glamour shots. You know, I feel like a broken record, because at the end of every video, I tell you that this might be my favorite piece I've ever built. But the honest truth is, this might be my favorite piece I've ever built. Not only are the lines incredibly clean on this piece, but it also has a lot of character. The maple hardwood drawer fronts and doors are really what shine. And for a large piece like this, I think that's really important. The linear lines of the cabinet doors really contrast well with the more organic lines of the drawer pulls and base. And I feel like those really tie into the organic texture of the wood grain. And admittedly, I'm a sucker for soft close hardware, so that's always a win. I also really love the symmetry this piece showcases. To me, everything feels really balanced and well thought out, which is always a goal, but not one that's always achieved. So bring on game night. So if you enjoyed this build and you want to see more like it, check out this video over here next. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one, and like always, I knew this would work, and I'll see you next time.